We are provided with a number of numerical values that summarize the findings, both in a paragraph format and in a summary data table. We are told that victims were majority white but disproportionately black, 52 versus 32%. This does not represent all Americans, but just those that were victims of such fatalities, and therefore this is a conditional proportion. So given that we're looking at a victim of law enforcement lethal use of force, then the probability that the victim was white was 52%. The probability that the victim was black was 32%. And we can see in the data table that this is computed as 424 out of those 812 versus 263 out of the same 812. Now, notice the use of the word disproportionately. This refers to the fact that the probability that a person is white given that they are a victim of a fatal use of law enforcement is 52%, but in general, the probability of being white is 72%. So the conditional probability P of white given law enforcement's fatality is different from the general probability P of white. The probability in general that a person in the US is black is 13%, but among victims of law enforcement fatal use of force, the conditional probability that the person is black given that they are a victim of such a fatality is 32%. So it is disproportionate in that a substantially higher proportion among those victims of law enforcement fatalities than we would expect based on their representation in the general population. Now, we are also told that the fatality rate was 2.8 times higher among blacks than whites. So the fatality rate is the rate calculated per 100,000 in the general population. So in the general population, we're looking at what is the probability of being a victim of law enforcement use of lethal force. And we do not have that overall probability. But what we do have is that probability broken down by each ethnic group. So what we have in the second data column is the conditional probability of being a victim of a law enforcement lethal use of force, given that you are white, 0.2 per 100,000, versus given that you are black, 0.5 per 100,000. And when you compare those two values, you end up with, as you can see, 0.2 versus 0.5, that's about 2.5 times, given the rounding in the data reported. So that means here we have probability of being a victim, given that you are black, is equal to 2.8 times the probability P of victim, given that you are white. Notice that the study reported that while most victims were reported to be armed, black victims were more likely to be unarmed, so not possess any weapons, than white victims or Hispanic victims. So the fact that the fatality rate was higher among blacks than among whites cannot be explained by the intensity of the situation or the risk to the police officer based on the victim being armed. Quite the contrary, in fact. Another thing we could think about is that maybe the data during this time period, 2009 to 2012, might have been somewhat unusual, but we do have a different database for the United States between 2015 and 2020. And we see the very same pattern where while there are more white individuals killed by the police than black individuals, 2,416 versus 1,265. In fact, the rate of police killing is substantially higher for blacks than for whites, 30 per million versus 12 per million. So here we're talking about, again, 2.5 times higher for blacks than for whites.